Hi, my name is Ryan. Today we're working on the charger again. This time, wiring. So if you watched my other video on when I cleaned up the fuse box, you'll know that I did get some electrical back. I got one of the lights in the steering column to work. I got the key to onto the on position, able to run the vehicle. But most electrical is not working. None of the lights work. My signals don't work. Horn doesn't work. I don't have any dashboard functions at all. And when I was testing in the fuse box, I found that even though I did have connectivity in all the fuses, the resistance was quite high. So that tells me that there's still a lot of corrosion in the fuse box. And honestly, the wiring in the car is in a pretty sorry state. And a lot of it doesn't match this diagram perfectly. Some of it matches pretty close, but a lot of it doesn't match perfectly. So instead of chasing all these gremlins and try to figure out every individual problem, I'm just going to rewire the car piece by piece. So that's a pretty daunting task, but if you look at this wiring diagram, this is pretty much all the wiring in the car, minus a few specific things. Since this is a classic car from the 70s, it's not like there's thousands of wires and lots of modules to go to. It's all pretty straightforward. The engine works, which is the main thing, so I'm going to try to leave that alone as much as I can. But then I'm just going to go through this system by system, so starting with the lights, turn signals, rear turn signals, horn, going one component at a time and get it all working. I figured that'll be way easier than trying to diagnose all these problems. I'll have to replace the fuse box at some point as well. Okay, so today I'm going to start with the headlight wiring. So first I'm going to just remove the whole wiring harness and remake a new harness. I'm going to try to reuse these connectors since I don't have replacements. I can just use blade connectors if I have to. So this wire goes to the horn. I'm going to snip it for now. The horn doesn't work right now either, and I have to rewire it anyway. The side marker lights also are running off the same harness because they share a ground, so I'll have to remember to leave a place for the ground for these as well. So this wiring harness goes behind the parking booster, and I can't get it out either way, so I'm just going to snip it here so I can pull the whole thing out. So I know I just said I'm going to redo all the wiring, but I'm going to try to preserve these connectors. They seem to be in relatively good shape, and if I can preserve them, that'll make my life a little bit easier, because then I can just do the same thing on the inside of the car and not have to source or custom make connectors for them. Worst case scenario, if this doesn't work, then I'll just cut it back off again. But first I'm going to salvage all of these individual connectors, test them and make sure they work, and then once I get the new wiring harness all made up, I'll solder them onto that. So for most things here, I'm going to use 18 gauge wire because I'm pretty sure that's what's already in here. But for the ground, I'm going to use 14 gauge wire because so many things ground to it. Now the thing about wire gauge is if you're not already familiar with it, so all I've done here is run the wire along the points it has to touch. So it has to go all the way to this marker light here, so I've taped it in place, right to the fender, run it into where the headlights go, up along here, into where the other headlights go, and over onto the other fender. So I'm going to do this with the rest of the wiring to build the harness. Now this one of course only runs across all the lights because it's just going to ground out here, but most of them are going to go back to the firewall there where the connector is. But same thing, I'm just going to run the wire along every point it needs to reach with a little bit of extra slack so I have some movement, and then that's how I'm going to build the harness out, and then I'll start doing all the connectors. This diagram is calling for a lot of striped wires, and I don't have any striped wires, I only have solid colors. Now I could just use solid colors or I could use a different color, but I want this wiring to match this diagram as close as possible to make maintenance easy, especially if someone other than me is having to do some work on this. So I've just been taking a Sharpie and making my own stripes. I don't know how well this will hold up long term, but I'm hoping it'll at least be recognizable in a few years if someone has to go back in there again. So after running all the wires, you're into with this colorful mess. Now the smart thing to do would leave this all exposed and hook everything up and make sure it all works. But I'm impatient and I'm going to throw a harness on it. Yeah. These plastic wiring looms are kind of a pain in the ass. You don't technically need it, but it keeps everything together, and it also protects the wires from rubbing up against things and getting worn through. And you can get better ones too. This is just what I had on hand. Okay, so even though I'm redoing all the wiring, I am trying to reuse a lot of the connectors, especially the ones in the firewall, just because assuming that they're in good shape, it'll be easier than trying to replace them. Before I go and reattach everything, we want to make sure that there actually is good connectivity in these connectors. So what we're doing is I've got my multimeter set to ohms, the lowest setting. You can see right there is 1, which means infinite resistance. Take the probes, put it against the wire, put it against the corresponding pin. See how it goes down? Should go down to almost nothing. And I'm going to do it for each of these before reattaching it to the wiring harness. Now the reason why I'm doing ohms and not just doing a continuity test is because I want to check the resistance too. The resistance should be really, really low on each of these. If it's not, if the resistance is really high, then that means that it's still really corroded or something's broken in here, in which case I should just replace it. But if each of these has very low resistance, then it's good to go. And I'll solder it into the wiring harness. Got the harness here. I've also made a pair of little helping hands here. They're just alligator clips on a piece of wire. So that way, when I go to solder them, I can just clip one side in here, clip the other side in there, and it'll hold it for me while I solder it. This is very tedious, and I don't want to fill my SD card with it, so I'm going to do all this off camera. But no, all I'm doing is checking each of these for resistance, making sure the resistance is low, soldering it all in, and while I'm doing that, comparing it to my wiring diagram to make sure that I'm connected to the right place. Luckily on this connector there's a fusible link, and this is obviously the big fusible link, so I can use this to orient myself and make sure I'm soldering on the right wire, even if the colors don't match perfectly. As well, when you're doing wiring, check the entire circuit you're working on, all the way back from the light to the connector, all the way into a dash, because I've noticed a misprint on this one where it's got both the parking light and the high beams going to the same pin on here. Now if you look at the other side, they're going to different pins, so obviously that's a misprint. And so I know that with number 13, the red wire actually needs to go to pin 14. Well, that was irritating. So you might notice that there's one here that's not connected to anything, it's just got a little quick connector on it. That's because this goes to the starter relay elsewhere in the car, so it's not going into the harness. So I just did this so I can make a quick connection instead of having to like try to run a wire and solder it in place or whatever. So I got the wiring harness in. Got the headlights wired up on both sides. These extra wires here are for the turn signals, which I haven't wired up quite yet. And I have got a battery hooked up, and I am getting power to the lights. This is a high beam on right now, and as you can see, it's not terribly bright. There is power to all of them. I checked them with the multimeter. I wasn't getting power before I redid this wiring harness. None of these lights are working at all. So I suspect that the reason why I'm not getting very much power is because some of the wiring in the car is still heavily corroded. But this is a good sign, because this means that I've partially solved the problem by rewiring these headlights. So as long as I keep going, finish the inside of the car, I should have good connectivity everywhere. And I also replaced the starter relay. It did not fix my problems with starting with the key, but that just adds to my theory that the wiring inside the car is quite corroded. So hopefully that'll be fixed once I go redo that wire. So even though I cleaned up the fuse box a bit and it got some things working, I still think one of the main problems with the electrical in that car is that fuse box. It's still very corroded. I did some testing, and a lot of the contacts still are having really, really high resistance, even though they are getting connectivity. So I think most things in the car just aren't getting enough voltage. I could try to clean it up some more, but the problem with that is all the contacts in there are steel and they're actually rusting away. So I'm pretty sure it just needs to be replaced. So rather than try to clean up those contacts individually or replace them, I just got a generic fuse box that uses more modern blade fuses. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to first cut the wires off the existing fuse box, label each one for what it was and where its position was on the existing fuse box, and then replicate the same layout on this one. So I'll end up with the exact same fuse layout, just with more modern fuses. The existing fuse box uses 8 fuses, this one uses 10 fuses. There's 4 on each side, so I'm just going to do the same thing, use 4 on each side and leave 2 spares here. So basically I got the fuse box here. As you can see, it's still pretty corroded. So I'm just going to go and snip each of these wires off, and then as I go, I'll label them with some tape and a Sharpie to where they correspond to, so that way I can recreate this exact same layout on the new fuse box. So pins 2, 3, and 4 share this pin. There's an equivalent on the other side, so I'm going to label this left and 2, 3, 4, so I know that this is shared across all 3 of those. Okay, so the camera died, but I kept going because this is very tedious. So I've stripped all the wires here and crimped on new connectors labeled with which fuse position they're supposed to go to. As well, I took the fuse box and I wired it to match the original, so these 2 bus bars here are across several pins. And I made similar bus bars here. I've wrapped them up just so that I don't accidentally short anything out if they touch something. But these pins here are all electrically connected. And now I just need to start plugging them in. Nice thing about doing it this way is if I do want to relocate these, all I gotta do is extend these wires out. Well, that escalated quickly. So replacing the fuse box didn't fix really any issues. So I suspect there's more wrong with the wiring in the dash, and now that I've pulled the dash out, you can see it's pretty chewed up back there. All the insulation's chewed up, and so I think there's some rodent activity back there. So I'm pulling the whole dash out right now. I've just stopped to give you an idea of what it takes to pull out a dash here. So I had to loosen up the steering column, which is just 4 bolts on the bottom of the steering column. Unplug as many wiring harnesses as I could from underneath the dash. Get this cowl off, which is just a series of screws. These ones here were a real pain in the ass to get at because they're right by the windshield. So I found the best way to do that was to go at it with just a screwdriver with a wobbly bit extension on it. And I kind of had to hold the wobbly bit in place and slowly turn it, and so they were a real pain to take out. Underneath this is a speaker. Holding the dash in, there's 4 bolts there, and there. I hold the dashboard of the firewall. Underneath there's 2 bolts that are kind of hard to see from here, but they just go from the bottom of the dash into the sides. The ones on the bottom you don't have to remove, you can just loosen them and lift the dash out. I removed them entirely because I'm having a really hard time lifting the dash out. I've disconnected all the wiring I can underneath, and now I'm going over top and disconnecting wiring harnesses. There was a some vent tubing there for the defroster. I took that out so I can get more access. It's really hard to film in this tight space, so I'm just going to keep taking this out. Okay, so now that the dash is out, looking at the wiring, it's actually in pretty good condition. There's some stuff that has been chewed on, which I'll be replacing. And there's a lot of stuff in here that just was never connected. So I'm going to go through, and instead of just going ahead and starting to replace things, the other problem I ran into is that this wiring diagram doesn't match perfectly. It matches pretty close. I already knew that it didn't match perfectly from the light harness, and I originally wanted to make the car match the diagram because this is the only diagram I have. But as I'm getting in here, I'm noticing that this is going to, if I'm going to get myself in trouble if I start trying to do that. So instead I'm exposing this whole wiring harness here, and I'm following each wire back to see where it goes. I'm going to test them individually and only replace the ones that need replacing. And I don't know, maybe I'll mark my diagram to show what it actually is in the car. I did have to replace a fuse box. The fuse box was one thing that was in really bad shape, which is why I thought the rest of this would be in bad shape, but it really isn't. So I'm going to clean it up. While I'm in here, I'm also going to replace these light bulbs. I'm going to put LEDs in here just so I don't have to go back in here again. The rest of the car, I'm not doing LEDs. All the exterior lighting is staying with the original filament bulbs. But for the dash, I'm going to do LEDs just so that I don't ever have to go back in here again. Okay, so I'm still working on the dash, and I'm waiting for some bulbs to show up so I can put them into the gauge cluster. But after I finish the dash and get that back in and working, the next thing I have to do is get wiring for all the lights. They're going to be in the tail end because there's actually no wiring harness at all going from the front of the vehicle to the back. So I'll need to make a new one. So what I'm going to do to get the rough length is I'm going to take this loom, I'm going to tape to the trunk here, and I'm just going to run this along the car to roughly where the dashboard's going to be. It's not going to be exact, but as long as it gets me enough to get from the dashboard to the trunk, where I can splice in additional or cut off more if I need to. And it is going to run along the driver's side, but I don't have easy access to the driver's side right now. So I'm just going to do it on the passenger side. Just run this on the car, and I'll cut it off there, and then I'll use this to figure out my lengths of wires and fill this with wires and install it into the driver's side of the car. Okay, so the rear wiring harness should be relatively simple. So I've got the right signal, left signal, the brake lights, and the reverse lights, which all need their own wire independently. And then the license plate, running lights, and marker lights. Well, those really should all be on at the same time. So I can just use a thicker gauge wire and run those all off the same wire. Now for the signal lights and the plate running marker lights, if I can't figure out where in the dash they're supposed to hook to originally, I can just loop them into the same system. I can just loop them into where the front equivalents are running into, and that should work just fine. The brake lights, that's relatively easy. I can just hook to the brake switch. And then the reverse lights, there's usually, in the transmission, there's usually a wire, so I'll have to find that. Worst case scenario, I guess I could rig something up in the shift column to tell when it's in the reverse, but preferably try to find the original point where this would connect to. But this is all relatively simple. I'm not going to connect these up today. I'm just going to run the wires and have them in place so that when I go to connect them up, they're just sitting right there, and I don't have to try to string wire through, especially after I get the interior in. So I just hung the harness up from the front of the back of the car just to make it easier to run the wires. Run all the wires through. Because these aren't going to match the diagram or anything like that, I've labeled each one of these at both sides so that I know what it is when I come back to it later, because I'm not going to be actually installing this right now. I'm going to put it in the car, but as far as wiring it up, at the front I'm going to have to wait till the dashboard's back in. At the back I'll have to wait till I get the actual bumper and tail lights and stuff back on. There's one wire I almost forgot to put in, which is the fuel gauge. The fuel gauge is run from like the trunk area, and I don't know if there's currently a wire for it already running. I kind of doubt it because I didn't see any. I can't find anything inside the car running from front to back right now, so I threw this in. If I don't need it, whatever. If I do need it, it's already run through. You may notice that I didn't put anything in for trunk lights because the trunk does have like a little dome light in it. I'm not going to run one of those. I don't see a need to, so I'm just going to leave it out. I can always add it in later. As far as the loom here, I've secured it with a bunch of zip ties down its length to keep it from splitting open. You could wrap this in electrical tape, but this is being run entirely inside the car, so I'm not too worried about moisture or debris getting into it. And doing it this way means that if I do need to run a new wire in, I can just poke it through and I don't have to undo a bunch of tape. So I'm just going to use the zip ties to keep it closed for now. Okay, now to go throw it in the car. Okay, so I've got it installed. Let's run it on the inside of the driver's side door sill. So it's stops up there underneath the dash. I think I've got enough to reach wherever I need to reach. If not, I can always crimp on extensions. And it just goes behind the seat here, because this behind the seat is actually open between the cabin and the trunk. So I just ran it behind the seat and all the way to the back, and so now it's in place. So all I gotta do is hook up the ends, which I'm not gonna do right now, but it'll make it a lot easier, because once the interior is in, once I got there's panels that go on here that'll cover that up. That will be much more difficult to run that, so running it now is much more convenient. Another thing I've been messing with is the door, trying to get the power windows to work. The mechanism, the motor and stuff is all in here, and I tested it earlier and it worked, but as soon as I tried it, the window seized up, and when I got looking to it, the window was off the track, and the track actually had no bolts in it. So I think at some point, when this car was sitting, I know someone tried to steal it at some point. So I think they were trying to take the window or some of the mechanisms out of this before they got spooked off. And I got it working. There's still one little bit of track missing here. There's a part of track on the inside that kind of runs along here. It doesn't seem, strictly speaking, necessary. The window works without it. But before I put this back together, I'm going to try to source or make it's just a little like 3-inch track that's here for a little piece. I think maybe just to keep the window from going off track if it hits something. So I'm going to make a little piece to go in here to act as a track. But other than that, the window does work right now. So if I jump it, If it seems a little slow, it's because my battery pack is dying. I'm gonna roll it back down. One thing I did notice is that if I roll it down all the way, it has a chance of the glass getting stuck on the door itself here. It might be related to this piece of track missing, or it might be related to the window rubber that's supposed to be here. I'm going to get the window rubbers and see if there's any pieces of it that go down behind the glass. If not, I'll fashion up just a little piece of steel with some felt on it to go behind the glass to make sure that when it comes up, it can never get stuck back here. But right now, I'm just remedying that by not rolling down the window all the way. The driver's side I haven't tested yet, but I had a look at it and everything seems to be where it should be. So I'm going to test that now. It's probably going to work, and I won't have to worry about that one too much. But this one I do need to do something with that little track and the window getting caught in there. Okay, so I replaced all the light bulbs. I also suspected there might be a grounding issue, so I did clean up the grounds and ran a new ground from the back plate of the instrument panel to the frame of the dashboard. And I ran a wire from that, which I'm going to run to the firewall and just ground it to the body in the charger, just to make sure I have at least one good solid ground. As well, I figured out where all the wires should go, except for one. There's one wire, I can't figure out where it goes in the dash, but I can figure out where it comes out in the engine bay. In the engine bay, it wasn't connected to begin with. So I'm just going to plug this all back in, and if there's one thing that's not working, it's probably that wire. And if everything works and I can't figure out what that wire's for, then I'll just tape it off because obviously it's not essential. But I'm hoping everything will work and I won't have to take the dash out again. So I'm just going to go put this back in the car now. Okay, so I got the dashboard back in. Not everything's hooked up yet, but most things are. As you can see, the seatbelt light's on. That one's really bright because it's an LED. And I don't know if you'll be able to really tell, but I can get panel lights. They're real dim because right now I'm just running this off of a boost pack and it's almost dead. And now the key works as well. The clicking is, again, the battery's almost dead, so it's not enough to actually turn it over. But that means that the dashboard's working now, so I can start to move on.